So George, this project is in effect a sequel to an earlier Naxos DVD that we worked on with the films The Plow That Broke the Plains from 1936 and The River from 1937, two classic American documentaries directed by Per Lorenz. And these films have no dialogue. They create a wonderful dialectic between distinguished cinematography and a literary script and important film music by Virgil Thompson. And the film we're dealing with now, The City, has music by Aaron Copland. The logic of revisiting these films with a fresh soundtrack is obvious. Since there's no dialogue, it's a simple matter to kill the soundtrack and re-record it, and we can hear these scores afresh. Obviously, the original soundtracks are from the 30s. They're monaural. You lose a lot of detail and a lot of the vividness of the music. How did it come about that these films were made without dialogue?
Well, the first reason is that location sound was so difficult and so expensive. At that time, you were recording not on tape, magnetic tape, you were recording on film. And so every time somebody spoke, it made a little sound, it made a little object on the film, which then has to be played back and triggers an electronic response in the microphone. So that the location recording was very, very difficult as well as expensive.
So here is a film aesthetic that makes a virtue out of a necessity.
You have brilliant narration. I don't think that the narration is respected now. We call it the voice of God, and we try to get away from it whenever we can. It's interesting how so much of the irony of this film comes from the narration. The narration sometimes speaks the facts. It speaks for the architectural critics. Sometimes it speaks for the viewer, echoing the emotional response of the viewer. And sometimes it speaks for the various characters in the film.
And the narrator has to be a virtuoso because he adopts different voices. And furthermore, there are passages of vocal montage where there's an intermingling of voices, in effect creating a different kind of music. The importance of the narration, too, is reflected, is it not, in that, unlike The Plow and The River, this is a film in which the narration and music rarely overlap. You've got segments with music, and you have segments with narration.
Well, the first 4 minutes of the film, there's no narration. There's that heavy text by Lewis Mumford at the beginning, which predicts that something dire is coming up. But for the first 4 minutes, it's all music. So the composer has a wonderful chance to set the emotional stage.
Yes, the composer's prerogatives in all three of these films are extraordinary compared to the norm in Hollywood. Let's talk about how this film came to be made in 1939 and who made it. Why don't you tell that story?
Well, it was made for the American Institute of Planners, but it was paid for by the Carnegie Foundation, and it was designed for the exhibition of the U.S. Pavilion at the World's Fair of 1939 and 1940, which was gathered in New York City.
The World of Tomorrow.
The World of Tomorrow. And of course, the World of Tomorrow in the second year was tragic because with the war beginning in Europe, so many of the national exhibitions got closed down. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, finally the Russian exhibition got closed down, so that the second year of the World's Fair was pretty grim. But the interesting thing is that this film is very funny. about a very serious topic. It's almost unique in the history of documentary that you have something funny about something serious. And the irony is brilliantly done. And it not only comes from the narration, it comes from, and the visuals, it comes from the music as well.
The Resettlement Administration is pertinent to this film and the Greenbelt movement. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Well, the Greenbelt movement influenced the town planning for the Resettlement Administration. I remember I was working for the Farm Security Administration at the time, which took over the early Depression experiments, which the government, the New Deal, introduced in 5 different places. The idea was that you would find places for unemployed, move them out of the cities into ideal towns, and persuade the factories to set up jobs for them. Well, this was all very fine, but they actually got 5 of these villages built in planned communities, and people are still living in them now because they were very well built and very well planned for living. But the relationship of jobs to the places where people were living simply didn't work out.
Well, let's talk about Greenbelt, Maryland, which is where, for the most part, the last segment of the city was shot, and is one of the Greenbelt communities that was created by the New Deal. As you mentioned, the goal was to integrate work and living with factories and other workplaces within the community. That's what we see in the film. Greenbelt still exists, but that didn't really happen.
No, it didn't happen. They became middle-class suburban communities where people commuted then to the larger cities nearby. And of course, they described the wonderful freeways that was going to make traffic move quickly. And now we know that.
And we see it moving quickly in the film, right?
But, and of course, they satirized the traffic jams brilliantly, the Sunday ride stuff that you see in the film.
Per Lorenz, who made The Plow and the River, had a hand in this film too. And we can see his fingerprints because, as you pointed out about The Plow and the River, they're structured as evangelical sermons, and this is a 3rd such sermon. Do you want to talk about the sermonizing in these films?
Well, you see, the 30s were a time when we believed in planning. Everything could be solved if we could just smart enough and had good town planners and good engineers, then we could solve all the world's problems. And the idea was that you replaced disorder with order. And we didn't know that that would also eliminate variety and people's different tastes.
What are the sermons in The River and The Plow That Broke the Plains?
The river particularly celebrates what we could do with the controlling nature. The ideal river is described as locked, dammed, regulated, and controlled. Well, as Katrina showed us, that's a recipe for disaster. In the Plow That Broke the Plains, we have the devastation of the plains by overplowing, and the replacement of that was going to be turning it into some kind of national parks.
So the template in both of these films, The River and The Plow, is you begin with a kind of state of grace,
Mhm.
the river, the land.
Mhm.
Then we see the problem,
Mhm.
the drought in the case of the plow that broke the plains, and flooding in the case of the river. And then we see the solution,
Mhm.
and that's the sermon. What's the sermon in the city, which Lorenz has similarly structured?
Well, the ridiculous thing is that the New England, old-fashioned New England town is introduced as the Eden.
It is.
And we see then the contradiction between that and what we have now, which is the awful cities. Smoke brings prosperity, you know. It says, the narration says quite ironically. And so we're going to be substituting all of that with what we see in Greenbelt, what we see in the planned community.
So it's exactly the same tripartite template
Very much the same.
and the same solution which we can now find questionable in retrospect.
Right.
What is the importance of this film in the history of the American documentary? Where do you place it?
Well, I would think that after Nanook of the North, the Flaherty film, and after the two Lorenz films, The Plow That Broke the Plains and The River, it is probably the next, partly because it shows you where we are in 1939, but also because it shows the brilliance of the editing. I don't think that that you can find even today better examples of the use of editing for making a statement.
Think of some specific examples in the film.
Well, the best example I know is, of course, the lunchtime sequence.
The lunch counter, an amazing sequence.
Where, and it's funny, and yet it says to the viewer, this is the way I'm feeling when I get caught up in the crowd at a lunchtime feeling. It's very rare that you have that conjunction of visual and sound and with what the viewer is feeling.
You've got frantic editing and frantic music, these flying motivic shards in Copland's score. It's such an unforgettable conjunction of music and the moving image.
Visual metaphor is what you get. And I'm sure the cameraman was sent out with the idea of getting visual metaphors.
You talked once to me about the visual metaphor of the end of Sunday traffic as well. Do you want to say a few words about the car that goes off the cliff?
One has an idea. Remember, this is a film that's rich in ideas. It's not just narrative, it's ideas. And finding ways of saying those ideas, of putting those ideas on the screen without dialogue is a challenge. And yet the filmmakers were trying to find some way of making you feel the results of what you were seeing. Go beyond what you were actually seeing to the results of what you were seeing. And so you found symbolic ways, they found symbolic ways of making you feel that way.
And they get away with it. I mean, it's over the top to have that car hurtling over the cliff and the occupants presumably dying. But since we experience it as a metaphor, we accept it.
And you're laughing not at the possibility that people are in that car.
Right.
You're laughing because that's just exactly the way I feel.
Right, yeah.
Another very interesting time is in the big city when they have all the machines going and the narrator echoes our feelings, gaining minutes and losing the day.
Mm-hmm.
That is a perfect example of an idea where the visuals and the narration and, of course, the music fixes that in the viewer's mind.
Remind me, what is the imagery at that moment?
You see hands at cash registers,
Right.
and other machinery, office machinery, the typewriter.
There's a paradox in this film that's unignorable, which is that its most memorable sequence is probably the city sequence, which we're supposed to disavow.
Mm-hmm.
And when it gets to the solution, the film becomes less interesting. And one reads that Ralph Steiner and Willard Van Dyke indeed were less interested, and I think it's obvious that Copeland too was less inspired by Mumford's dream of the green belt than was Mumford himself in the scripting of the film. What do you make of this disequilibrium in the film?
Well, first you should remember that this film was made to be seen by large audiences of middle-class Americans who would come into the fair. And if you would look at the jokes in that last section, the little boy with the tire that blows out twice, the baseball player who gets thrown in the water, all of these are parallel with the kinds of things that you were getting on radio with the soap operas. It's crude, middle class, almost childish humor. But I'm sure with a large audience, this got lots and lots of laughter. Laughter of recognition for the simple life and the simple joys that it represents.
You've just reminded me that you once remarked to me that no previous documentary had been seen by nearly as many people as was the city.
If you look at the review in the New York Post by Archer Winston, you'll see that this critic, that he was next to Bosley Crowther, the most respected movie critic at the time, said that after The River and The Plow That Broke the Plains, this was the most startling documentary and worthy documentary that America will see.
What else did he have to say in that review that you find interesting or memorable?
People have never cared for documentary pictures, even when they are impressive, eloquent, and meaningful, as The Plow That Broke the Plains and The River, will have to revise their opinion when they see the city. That extraordinary documentary argument for city planning. It will be shown several times daily at the Little Theater of the Science and Education Building of the World's Fair. If there were nothing else worth seeing at the fair, this picture would justify the trip and all the exhaustion.
My goodness.
By the way, even Archer Winston, in his otherwise laudatory review of the film, has certain reservations about the last section, pointing out that it visually and emotionally isn't as strong as the rest of the film.
Do you buy that? Is that your impression as well?
Particularly because of my own bias in favor of the joys of the city and the variety of the city, as against the dullness of and the lack of variety of the suburbs.
Is there anything else before we go to the music that you want to say about the film?
Don't forget how rare it is to find humor in documentary, particularly one which wrestles with such heavy subject matter as city planning. And so for this alone, it needs to be celebrated.
Yes, I'm thinking back to The Plow That Broke the Plains and The River, and indeed, there's less humor in those films than there is in this one.
There's pathos and a strong appeal to one's civic responsibility.
This film has a light touch. I'm thinking now maybe we can segue into Copland's achievement via Sunday traffic. Here's a scene, a long scene about traffic jams and congestion. There are ambulances, there are sirens, there's the car going off the cliff. And the music for this scene is a jaunty dance in counterpoint, ironic counterpoint. I can't help but think that Copland got the idea partly from the ending of The Plow That Broke the Plains, where there's a cavalcade of cars fleeing deserted farms, and Thompson has furnished a habanera. So here we have a dance for the stalled traffic, and indeed it introduces a light touch to a sequence that might otherwise be just depressing.
It seems to me that the film was put together by filmmakers who were thinking of this as an audience film. Now, so many documentaries are seen nowadays by small groups, or people seeing them alone. But they knew that they were going to have, they had to keep a middle-class family audience sitting still in the theater for 30-some minutes, considering very serious ideas. And so all of the humor that's put in provokes audience response. And that is something that is rare in documentary.
Well, this certainly speaks to where Copland's head was at the time. We're talking about a composer who had been a card-carrying modernist, who wrote his piano variations as a rebellious young man and shocked classical music audiences when it was composed in 1930. And then, like so many artists and intellectuals in the 30s, he acquired a pronounced social conscience on the left. He became, as it were, a part of the popular front, and was consumed by the idea of composing a music that would speak, as he put it, to both us and them. Us being the artists and intellectuals, and them being this vast new audience that, for instance, went to films. So he took an interest in Hollywood, and we know that his friend Harold Klorman went out to Hollywood and said, come to Hollywood. Antheil had composed for Hollywood, Korngold had composed for Hollywood, Ernst Tach had composed for Hollywood. There were rumors that Shostakovich and Stravinsky and Schoenberg would compose for Hollywood. So it became his strategy to become a film composer and a Hollywood film composer by first composing the music for this documentary. And I'm sure he felt exactly what you just expressed, that if he was to perform his function as a socially useful artist, he had to compose music as he had already composed for El Salón Mexico and was about to compose for Billy the Kid in Appalachian Spring, that people would like, that would not be experienced as esoteric or intellectual. And the city did become Copland's ticket to Hollywood. Almost immediately, he was engaged by Louis Milestone, a Hollywood director on the left, to do the music for Mice and Men, and he also scored The Red Pony, another Milestone film. He scored Our Town. He got an Academy Award for The Heiress. But that was an unhappy experience for him working with William Wyler. His music was bowdlerized, and he left Hollywood at that point. So we can say, looking back, I think, that he had more control over the film and over the use of music in the film with this 1939 film, The City, than he ever had in Hollywood. The other film that comes to mind as a comparable instance is Something Wild, his last film
Yeah,
score for an independent film that was shot in New York City, where again, there are long stretches, as in the city, with no dialogue or narration, but it's not as good a film as the city. How do you, as a filmmaker, George, perceive or appreciate the use of music in this particular film?
Well, I've never seen it used so well as in the city, the music.
You know,
I think it's a lesson for all of us. But it is a particular case. Most of the time I find that I resent music telling me what to feel. And yet I'm praising this for the score for doing exactly the same thing. Maybe it's because the abstract ideas in the film are so heavy that the musical commentary on it is a relief. But I've never seen it done as brilliantly.
but that's certainly the case with The Plow and the River. Heavy content and the irony of Thompson's score lightens the tone in a way that's actually necessary, or else these films would become, in some places, unbearable. And Thompson's achievement is certainly a huge influence on Copland here in at least two respects. One is the use of irony. We talked about the irony of Sunday traffic in relation to the irony of that habanera in The Plow That Broke the Plains. But there's also a similarity in texture. They're both reacting against what they see as a Eurocentric Hollywood film template. The music of Korngold, the music of Steiner. First, they don't like it because it's so upholstered, it's so thick, and not American, not plain and simple. And secondly, they don't like it because they find it's too literal. They use the term Mickey Mousing to deride the use of leitmotifs in Korngold, his slavish adherence at every moment to the affect, the emotional affect of the film. So he's following in Thompson's footsteps. And yet I also notice, comparing The Plow and the River with the city, the differences between these composers. Thompson is more of an aphorist. He'll compose in sentences or paragraphs, where Copland is composing as a symphonist in chapters. And if you look closely at the music of the city, you'll find that the treatment of the tunes, the way they're varied, the way they come back, is conducive to structuring large segments of music that correlate with large segments of the film.
Past the city, I know nothing about Copland's scores for movies.
I would say his impact on Hollywood composers was absolutely tangible, and they've many times testified to that effect. David Raxon, who scored Laura, said, for instance, that Copland gave them license to compose differently, that they no longer had to imitate those Europeans like Korngold and Steiner. He introduced the possibility of a leaner and more American sound. Certainly that was a dramatic influence on the scoring of Western films. Andre Previn, who of course as a young man was a Hollywood composer, once said that the lesson of Copland's film scores was fewer notes